Once upon a time, there was a young woman named Sarah who worked as a night security guard in a large, old office building. She often worked alone, patrolling the halls and making sure everything was in order. One night, as she was walking down a long, dimly lit corridor, she heard a strange noise coming from the back of the building. It sounded like someone was shuffling around back there. Sarah called out, but there was no answer. Feeling uneasy, she cautiously made her way towards the back of the building. As she turned the corner, she saw a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. Sarah froze in fear. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, leaving her in complete darkness. Sarah tried to use her flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. She was completely alone and unable to see anything. Then, she heard the sound of footsteps coming towards her. She could feel someone breathing on the back of her neck. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just then, the elevator dinged and the doors opened. Sarah quickly ran inside, slamming the door shut behind her. But as soon as she pressed the button for the ground floor, she realized that the elevator wasn't moving. Panic set in as Sarah frantically pressed the buttons, trying to get the elevator to work. She could feel someone or something was watching her from outside. After what felt like an eternity, the elevator finally started moving. As the doors opened on the ground floor, Sarah saw that there was nobody there. She quickly ran out of the building and never looked back. From that night on, Sarah refused to work alone in the old office building. And whenever she passed by the elevator, she couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine.
I had been talking to him online for weeks and finally agreed to meet up for a dinner date. He picked a fancy restaurant on the outskirts of town, and I arrived promptly at the agreed-upon time. But as I walked through the door, I noticed that something was off. The restaurant was empty, and the staff seemed to be on edge. They showed me to a table in the back and disappeared into the kitchen. As I waited for my date, I began to feel more and more uneasy. The restaurant was too quiet, too still. I thought about leaving, but before I could make my escape, he arrived. He was charming and handsome, and I couldn't help but be drawn to him. We ordered our food and began to chat, but there was something strange about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. As the night wore on, the restaurant grew colder and emptier. The staff disappeared, and we were the only ones left. When we finished our meal, he suggested that we go for a drive to get to know each other better. I hesitated, but something in his eyes told me that I had no choice. We got into his car and he began to drive, but we soon found ourselves on a desolate road with no other cars in sight. That's when he told me his true intentions. He had been watching me for weeks, studying my every move online. He wanted to make me his own, to keep me trapped and captive forever. I tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. He locked me in the trunk of his car and drove off into the night, leaving me alone and terrified in the darkness. I don't know how long I was trapped in that trunk, but it felt like an eternity. When he finally opened it and dragged me out, I was too weak to resist. But just when I thought all was lost, I heard a faint siren in the distance. The police had been following us, and they had finally caught up. I never saw him again, but I'll never forget the terror that I felt that night. It's a reminder to always be careful when it comes to online dating, because you never know who might be waiting on the other side of the screen.
A construction company had been working on a new building for weeks, with all hands on deck to ensure the project was completed on time. But one day, a worker went missing without a trace. As the days turned into weeks, the company became increasingly worried about the missing worker. Some of the workers started to report strange happenings around the construction site. They heard whispers in the shadows and felt a cold, eerie presence that seemed to follow them. One day, while searching through the missing worker's locker, they found a small, unmarked box. It was sealed shut, with no indication of what was inside. But there was something about the box that made the workers feel uneasy, as if it was radiating an ominous energy. Despite their apprehension, the workers decided to open the box. But as soon as they tried to pry it open, they found that it was completely sealed shut, as if it had been welded closed. The workers tried everything to open the box, but to no avail. And as they continued to try, they began to notice more strange occurrences around the construction site. They heard footsteps where there should be none, and saw shadows flitting just out of sight. One night, as the workers were leaving the construction site, they saw a figure lurking in the shadows. It was a man with a crooked nose. He stared at the workers with dark, piercing eyes, and then disappeared into the night. Something even more odd happened. The unopened box disappeared on that very same night. No one ever saw the box again. After that encounter, the workers became even more uneasy, and rumors started to spread about the missing worker. Some believed that he had been taken by the man with a crooked nose, while others thought that the box was cursed. Despite their fears, the workers continued to work on the construction site, always on the lookout for the man with a crooked nose and the mysterious box. And though they never found out what was inside the box or what had happened to the missing worker, they never forgot the fear that had consumed them during that time.
Last year, I was on a business trip and stayed in an old hotel. Around midnight, I heard a sound coming from outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a faint tapping sound. I sat up in bed and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything. And then I heard it again, a rustling sound, like someone was moving around in the bushes. I started to feel uneasy, but I tried to dismiss it as my imagination. Maybe I was just nervous about staying in an old hotel. But then I heard another sound, a creaking sound, like someone was climbing up the fire escape ladders outside my ground floor hotel room. My heart started to race as I realized that someone was outside my window. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, but it was locked. I tried to call the front desk, but my phone wasn't working. And then I saw him, a man with a twisted grin on his face, peering through my window. He was a peeping Tom, and he was staring right at me. I screamed and backed away from the window, but the man just laughed and pulled out a shining knife. He started to climb through the window, and I knew that I had to act fast. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table and smashed it over his head. He stumbled backwards, dropping the knife, and I ran past him and jumped out the window. I immediately ran back to the hotel lobby and informed the front desk staff of what had happened. I called the police, and the man was caught and arrested. But even though the man was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that had settled in my chest. I never stayed in an old hotel again, and every time I heard a sound outside my window, I couldn't help but think of the peeping Tom and his shining knife.
It was a foggy night, and I was driving home late after a long day at work. The road was deserted, with nothing but dense woods on either side. As I drove, I noticed a car behind me, its headlights piercing through the thick fog. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe it was just someone else heading home late. But as I drove further, I realized that the car was following me, staying uncomfortably close to my bumper. I started to feel uneasy, wondering why this car was following me in the middle of nowhere. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But the car stayed behind me, never once backing off. As I approached a bend in the road, I saw something in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was a tall, dark figure, its features obscured by the fog. But I could feel its gaze on me, following me as I drove by. Suddenly, the car behind me swerved, nearly colliding with me. I slammed on my brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. As the car sped past me, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a pale, gaunt face, eyes fixed on the figure in the woods. I watched in horror as the car disappeared into the fog, leaving me alone on the deserted road. I knew then that I had to get out of there as fast as possible. I stepped on the gas, my tires screeching on the pavement. I could still feel the figure's eyes on me, its presence lingering long after it had vanished from view. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly terrifying. This story happened when I was 7 years old. It was Halloween night, and my parents had taken me and my little brother out trick-or-treating. As we went from house to house, we noticed a small drugstore that we had never seen before. As we approached the store, we saw a humped man standing outside, handing out lollipops to kids. He was dressed in a tattered coat and had a strange look in his eyes. Something about him made me feel uneasy, but I shrugged it off and took a lollipop from him. As we continued down the street, I started to feel sick. My head was spinning, and my legs felt weak. My parents immediately took me home, and I passed out in bed. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and disoriented. My parents took me to the hospital, where the doctors ran some tests. It turned out that the lollipop I had received from the humped man was laced with drugs. I was lucky to have survived, but the incident left a lasting impression on me. From that day on, my parents were much more cautious about where we went trick-or-treating. And every Halloween, I can't help but think about the humped man and the terrifying experience I had as a child. As a child, I loved spending time in my grandparents' old toy room. It was filled with antique dolls, wooden trains, and a variety of other vintage toys that I loved playing with. But there was one toy that always gave me the creeps, a clown doll that sat in the corner of the room, its painted-on smile seemingly getting wider every time I looked at it. One day, as I was playing with a puzzle in the toy room, I noticed that one piece was missing. I searched high and low, but it was nowhere to be found. That's when I heard a faint laughter coming from the clown doll in the corner. It sounded almost like a child's giggle, but it was too sinister to be anything but evil. Suddenly, the lights went out and the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped in the toy room with nothing but the clown doll and the missing puzzle piece. As I fumbled through the darkness, I could feel something breathing down my neck. I could hear footsteps creeping up behind me, and the faint sound of children's laughter echoing through the room. Finally, I found the missing puzzle piece and jammed it into the empty slot. That's when the lights flickered back on, and I saw the clown doll moving on its own, its painted smile now twisted into a malevolent grin. I ran out of the toy room and back to my bedroom, but the horrors didn't end there. As I lay in bed that night, I heard strange whispers and scratching coming from beneath the floorboards. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and when I woke up the next morning, I knew that something had followed me home from that toy room. It was a reminder that sometimes, the things we fear as children can haunt us for the rest of our lives. As the snowstorm raged on, a camper named Lisa found herself lost in a dense bamboo field. She had been driving through the mountains, trying to make it to her family's cabin for a weekend retreat, when the storm hit, and she lost control of her vehicle. Lisa trudged through the snow, hoping to find a way out of the bamboo field and back to the safety of her camper. But the bamboo stalks seemed to go on forever, and the snowfall was so thick that she could barely see more than a few feet in front of her. As she stumbled through the bamboo, Lisa heard a strange and unsettling sound coming from somewhere within the field. It was a soft, almost musical sound, but there was something sinister about it that made her skin crawl. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Lisa followed the sound, hoping to find its source and perhaps a way out of the bamboo field. But as she drew closer, the sound grew louder and more intense until it became almost deafening. Suddenly, Lisa stumbled upon a clearing in the bamboo field, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. In the center of the clearing stood a group of figures, all dressed in long, flowing robes and swaying back and forth in time with the haunting music. Lisa watched in horror as the figures continued their eerie dance, their faces shrouded in shadow and mystery. She tried to turn and run, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot, and she was unable to move. Suddenly, one of the figures broke away from the group and began to move towards her. Lisa tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat as the figure drew closer, its face still shrouded in darkness. As the figure loomed over her, Lisa felt a sudden gust of wind, and the snow began to swirl around them, obscuring everything from view. When the wind died down and the snow cleared, the figure was gone, and Lisa was left alone in the bamboo field once more. Shaken and terrified, Lisa stumbled through the snow until she found her camper and drove back to civilization, vowing never to return to that cursed bamboo field again. During a road trip, my friends and I had stopped at a casino in the middle of the desert. As we walked around the casino floor, I felt a sudden urge to use the restroom. As I entered the restroom, I overheard a group of shady-looking men in dark suits discussing some sort of heist they were planning. I froze in shock, realizing that I had stumbled upon some sort of gang activity. I listened intently to their conversation, trying to gather as much information as possible. They spoke in hushed tones, but I could hear enough to understand that they were planning a robbery. After they left, I quickly washed my hands and hurried out of the restroom. I found my friends and told them what I had heard. We immediately alerted the front desk staff, who called the police. As we left the casino, we could see the police arresting the men in suits. It was a surreal and frightening experience. The memory of that night stayed with me, and I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't overheard the gangsters' conversation. I was grateful to have been in the right place at the right time, and to have played a small role in preventing a potentially dangerous situation.